Let's read chapter 3 of Possession. In this dim place, the creeping nighthawk with his sooty scales gnaws at the great tree's root, and makes his nest curled in the knotted maze of which he feeds. Ash, Ragnarok 3. Roland went to Bloomsbury to his bicycle next morning, setting off very early when Val was still applying her workaday face. He went whizzing perilously through and through the sticking 5-mile warm and traffic across Putney Bridge, along the embankment, through Parliament Square. He had no office in his old college, but inhabited an office on sufferance for his few hours part-time teaching. Here, in an empty silence, he unpacked his bicycle panniers and went up to the pantry where the bulk of the Sherrocks squatted among some savoury tea towels beside a tea-stained sink. Whilst the machine warmed up in the din and hum of the extractor fan, he took out his 2 letters and read them again. Then he spread them face down, to be scribed on the black glass, under which the rods of green light floated and passed, and the machine spat out hot and chemical-scented spectrograms of those writings, black-rimmed by empty space as the originals were edged by the century's dust. He was honest. He wrote his debt in the departmental notebook on the draining board. Roland Michael, 2 sheets, 10 pins. He was dishonest. He now had a fair copy and could slip the letters back and remark it into the London Library vehicle. But he didn't want to. He felt they were his. He had always slightly despised those enchanted by things and touched by the great. Balzac's orange walking stick, Robert Louis Stevenson's flake jeweled, a black lace mantilla once worn by George Eliot. Mortimer Cropper was in the habit of rounding Randolph Henry Ash's large gold watch from an inner pocket and arranging his time by Ash's timepiece. Roland's Sherrocks were cleaner and clearer than the faded crockery raised script of the originals. Indeed, the copying had a black and gleaming freshness. The machine's rollers must have been newly inked, but he wanted the originals. When Dr. Williams' library opened, he presented himself and asked to see the manuscripts of Crab Robinson's monumental diary. He had been there before, but had to use Blackadder's name to remind them, though he had no idea of showing Blackadder what he had found, yet at least, not until his own curiosity was satisfied and the papers restored. He started reading in 1856, the year of publication of God's Men and Heroes, which Crab Robinson, indefatigable, had read and commented on. June 4. Read several dramatic poems of Randolph Ashe's new book. I noted particularly those purporting to be spoken by Augustine of Hippo, Agustin de Hipona, the 9th century Saxon monk, Gottschalk, and neighbor Pliable from Pilgrim's Progress. Also a singular evocation of Franz Mesmer and the young Mozart playing their glass harmonica at the court of the Archduke in Vienna, full of sounds and strange airs excellently conceived and embodied. This Gottschalk, a precursor of Luther, even to renouncing his vows, might be thought in his intransigent predestinarian vision to figure some of the later evangelicals of our day. A neighbor pliable, perhaps a satire upon those like myself, who believe that Christianity does not consist in the idolatrous presence of a deity in a piece of bread, not yet in the 5 points of metaphysic faith. As is his wont, Ash treats Pliable, with whom he might be supposed to sympathize, with more apparent spleen than he directs towards his monstrous monk, whose ravings have certain real sublimity. It's difficult to know where to have Randolph Ash. I fear he will never become a popular poet. His evocation of the Black Forest in Gottschalk is very fine, but how many of the public are prepared to endure his theological strictures? To come to it, he convolutes and wreathes his melodies with such a forcing of rhyme, such a thicket of peculiar and ill-founded analogies, that his meaning is hard to discern. Wrath. When I read Ash, I think of the younger Coleridge reciting with gusto his epigram upon Donne, with Donne whose muse of Dromedary trots, wreath iron pokers into true love knots. This passage was already well known to Ash scholars and had been extensively quoted. Roland likes Crabbe Robinson, a man of indefatigable goodwill, intellectual curiosity, delight in literature and learning, and yet full of self-deprecation. I early found that I had not the literary ability to give me such a place among English authors as I should have desired, but I thought I had an opportunity of gaining a knowledge of many of the distinguished men of the age, and that I might do some good by keeping a record of my interviews with them. He had known them all, 2 whole generations, Wordsworth, Coleridge, De Quincey Lamb, de Staël, Goethe, Schiller, Carlyle, Lewis, Tennyson, Clough, Bagehot. Roland read through 1857 and embarked of 1858. In the February of that year Robinson wrote, "Were this my last hour, and that of an octogenarian cannot be far off, I would thank God for permitting me to behold so much to the excellence conferred on individuals. Of women, I saw the type of her heroic greatness in Mrs. Siddons, of her fascinations in Mrs. Jordan and Mill Moss. I listened with rapture to the dreamy monologues of Coleridge, that old man eloquent. I travelled with Wordsworth, the greatest of our lyrico-philosophical poets. I relished with wit and pathos of Childland. I conversed freely with Goethe at his own table, beyond all competition, the supreme genius of his age and country. He acknowledges his obligations only to Shakespeare, Spinoza, and Linnaeus, as Wordsworth. When he resolved to be a poet, feared competition only with Chaucer, Spenser, Shakespeare, and Milton. In June, Roland found what he had been looking for. My breakfast party went off very well indeed, as far as talk was concerned. I had with me Basil Hart, Ash, Mr. Jameson, Professor Spear, Miss Lamotte, and her friend Miss Glover. The last somewhat taciturn. Ash had never met Miss Lamotte, who indeed came out exceptionally to please me and to speak of her dear father, whose mythologies I have had some hand in bringing before the English public. Discussion of poetry was animated especially of Dante's incomparable genius, but also of the genius of Shakespeare and his poems, especially the playfulness of his young works, which Ash particularly admires. Miss Lamotte spoke more forcefully than I would have expected. She is surprisingly handsome when animated. We discussed also so-called spiritual manifestations, about which Lady Byron wrote to me with grave feeling. There was talk of Mrs. Stowe's claim to have conversed with the spirit of Charlotte Bronte. Miss Glover, in one of her few interventions, said warmly that she believed such things could and did happen. Ash said he would require full proof, experimental conviction, and did not imagine it would be forthcoming. Miss Hart said that Ash's presentation of Mesmer's belief in spiritual influences showed he was less rigorously confined by positive science than he now claimed to be. Ash replied that the historical imagination required a kind of poetic belief in the mental universe of his characters, and that this was so strong with him that he was in danger of having no beliefs of his own at all. All appealed to Miss Lamotte on the question of the rapid spirits. She declined to express an opinion, answering only with a Mona Lisa smile. Roland copied out this passage and read on, but could find no further reference to Miss Lamotte, though Ash was a fairly frequent host and guest. Robinson paid tribute to Mrs. Ash's excellent housekeeping and lamented that she had never become the mother she was ideally suited to be. He did not appear to have noticed any extraordinary knowledge of Ash's poetry, neither Miss Lamotte or Miss Glover. Perhaps the conversation, pleasant and unexpected, or alternatively extraordinary, had taken place elsewhere or on another occasion. Crabbe Robinson's records looked out transcribed in Roland's own rather cramped script, less confident, less homogeneously part of life. Roland knew that statistically he was almost bound to have corrupted this text in some way, if only by inadequate transcription. Mortimer Cropper's graduate students were made to transcribe passages, usually from Randolph Henry as transcribe again their own transcriptions, type them up, and then scan them for errors with severe editorial eye. There was never an error-free text. Cropper said he kept this humbling exercise even in the days of effortless photocopying. There was no such professional method about Blackadder, who nevertheless noticed and corrected the plethora of errors, accompanying this correction with a steady series of disparaging comments on the declining standard of English education. In his day, he said students were grounded in spelling and had learned poetry and the Bible by heart. Another phrase by heart, he would add, as though poems were stored in the bloodstream, felt along the heart. As Wordsworth said, Blackadder learned poetry, Blackadder said, but in the best English tradition, he did not consider it his business to equip his deficient students with tools they had not got. They must muddle through in a fog of grumble and contempt. Roland went to the British Museum in search of Blackadder. He had not made his mind what to say to him, so spent time establishing a position in the reading room under the high dome, which, however high, held, he felt, insufficient oxygen for all the diligent readers, so that they lay somnolent like flames dying in Humphrey Davy's bell jar, as their sustenance was consumed. It was afternoon. The morning had gone to Crab Robinson, which meant that all the ample heights of blue leather desks along the spokes of the great wheel that radiated from superintendent's desk and sphered by the catalogue were taken, and he had to be content with one of the minimal flat triangular ends of the late comb segments inserted between these spokes. These inserts were ghost desks, secondary desks, stammering desk, DDGOO. He found a place at the end of the AA for Ash, near the door, and his first pleasure at being admitted to this inner circle of learning, he had compared it to Dante's Paradiso, in which the saints and patriarchs and virgins sat in orderly ranks in circular formation, a huge rose, and also the leaves of a huge volume, once scattered through the universe, now gathered, the gold lettering on the soft blue leather added to the medieval imagining. In which case the ash factory had the bowels of a building was the inferno. There was a way down on iron rungs from the reading room, and a way out through a high locked portal which brought you up into the sunless Egyptian necropolis amongst blind staring far off, crouching scribes, minor sphinxes, and empty mummy cases. The ice factory was a hot place of metal cabinets and glass cells containing the clatter of typewriters looming lit by neon tubes. Micro-readers glowed green in its gloom. It smelled occasionally sulphurous when the photocopiers short-circuited. It was even beset by wailings and odd shrieks. The whole of the lower regions of the British Museum reeks of tomcat. The creatures wore their way in through grantings and air bricks, prowl and are harried, and occasionally stealthily fed. Blackadder sat amongst the apparent chaos and actual order of his great edition, sifting and drift of small paper slips in a valley between cliffs, of furred-edged index cards, and bulging, molted files. Behind him filtered his clerical assistant, pale Paola, her long colourless hair bound in a rubber band, her huge glasses moth-like, her fingertips dusty grey pads. In an inner room beyond the typewriter cubicle was a small cavern constructed of fallen cabinets, inhabited by Dr. Beatrice Nest, almost bricked in by the boxes containing the diary and correspondence of Ellen Nash. Blackadder was 54, had come to letting us out of Pickwick. He was the grandson of Scottish schoolmasters. His grandfather recited poetry on firelight evenings. Marmion child Harold Ragnarok. His father sent him to Downing College in Cambridge to study under F. Lewis. Lewis did to Blackadder what he did to serious students. He showed the magnificent importance and urgency of English literature and simultaneously deprived him of any confidence in his own capacity to contribute to or change it. The young Blackadder wrote poems imagined Dr. Lewis' comments on them and burned them. He devised an essay style of Spartan brevity, equivocation, and penetrability. His fate was decided by a seminar on dating. The Cambridge room was crowded, the floor full, the chair arms perched on. The lean and agile Don, in his open-necked shirt, stood on the window-sill and tucked the casement to let in fresh air. Cold Cambridge light. The dating handout contained a troubadour lyric and piece of dramatic Jacobean verse, some satirical couplets, and black verse meditation on volcanic map and love song. Blackadder, schooled by his grandfather, saw immediately that all these poems were by Randolph Henry Ashe, examples of ventriloquism of his unwieldy range. He himself had two choices: to state his knowledge or to allow the seminar to proceed, with Lewis enticing unfortunate undergraduates into making wrong identifications, and then proceeding to demonstrate his own analytic brilliance in distinguishing fake from authenticity. Victorian alienation from the voice of the truth-telling, Blackadder chose silence, and Ashe was duly exposed and found wanting. Blackadder felt he had somehow betrayed Randolph Henry Ashe. He might more justly have been thought to have betrayed himself, his grandfather, or possibly Dr. Lewis. He compensated. He wrote this the unconscious argument and unconscious bias, a source tension in the dramatic poems of Randolph Henry Ashe. He became an expert on Ashe's most unfashionable days. He had been talked into editing the complete poems and plays as early as 1959. With the blessing of the present Lord Ashe, an elderly Methodist peer, who was a descendant of a remote cousin of Ashe himself and heir to the ownership of unsold manuscripts. He had in those days of innocence seen the edition as a finite task that would lead on to other things. He had research assistants in fluctuating numbers, whom he dispatched like Noah's doves and ravens into the libraries of the world, clutching numbered slips of paper like cloakroom tickets of luncheon vouchers, each containing a query, a half-line possible quotation, a proper name to be located, the hub of a Roman chariot tracked through Gibbon's footnotes, the dangerous dreamed melon of the sage, which turned out to come from the dream of Descartes. Ashe had been interested in everything: Arab astronomy and African transport systems, angels and oil couples, hydraulics, and guillotined druids and Grand Armée, Catharists, and Princess Devils, ectoplasm, and solar mythology. The last metals are frozen mastodons and the true nature of mana. The footnotes engulfed and swallowed the text. They were ugly and ungainly but necessary, Blackadder thought, as they sprang up like the heads of the Hydra, two to solve in the place of one solved. He thought often in his dim place of how a man becomes his job. What would he be now if he had become, say, a civil servant, a lodging housing finance, or a policeman poring over bits of hair and skin and some bold prints? This was a very Ash-like speculation. What would knowledge be? Collected for its own sake, for his own sake that was, for James Blackadder, with no reference to the picking, the suggestion, and leavings of Randolph Henry Ash. There were times when Blackadder allowed himself to see clearly that he would end his working life, that was to say, his conscious thinking life, in this task that all his thoughts would have been another man's thoughts. If he was subordinate, he believed Mortimer Cropper thought himself the lord and owner of Ash, but he, Blackadder, knew his place better. He had once seen a naturalist on television who seemed to him to be an analogue of himself. This man went out with a pouch and gathered up all owl pellets, which he labelled and later took apart with forceps, bathed in glass beakers of various cleansing fluids, ordering and rearranging the odds and fragments of the owl's compressed package of bone, tooth, and fur, in order to reconstitute the dead shrew and slow worm which had round died, and make its way through owl gut. He was pleased with this image and momentarily considered making a poem out of it. Then he discovered Ash had been beforehand with him, had described an archaeologist. Finding out Ash battles from strife of shattered blades of mashed and splintered bones, or broken brains pans, as the curate reads. A death of fowl or slow worm is dried, packets tidy old etched, cast out, by wild death floating by on soft sails. The bloody hook curved in the dawn rough. Then Blackadder could not think whether he had noticed the screen naturalist because his mind was primed with Ash's image or whether it had worked independently. Roland emerged from tunnels of shelving into Blackadder's icily lit domain. Paola smiled at him and Blackadder frowned. Blackadder was a grey man, with a grey skin and ivory grey hair, which he wore rather long because he was still so thick. His clothes, tweed jacket, cord trousers were respectable, well worn and dusty, like everything else down there. He had a good ironic smile when he smiled, which was very frequently. Roland said, "I think I've made a discovery. It will probably turn out to have been discovered 20 times already." "What's it?" I went to read his Vico, and it's still cramped, with his manuscript notes bursting with them between every page. In the London Library, Cropper will have been through it with a tooth comb. I don't think so. I don't think so. All the dust is set in black rooms, It reaches the edge of paper. No one's touched it for a long time. I guess not ever. I read some. Useful? Oh, very, enormously. Blackadder, reluctant to show excitement, began to clip together bits of paper. "I'd better have a look," he said. "I'd better see for myself. I'll get over there. You didn't disturb anything." "Oh, no. Oh, no. That is a lot of papers simply flew off when the book was open. But we put them back in place, I think. I don't understand it. I thought Cropper was ubiquitous. You'd better keep this absolutely hush-hush. You understand, or it'll all be whining its way across the Atlantic, while the London Library replaces its carpets and installs a coffee machine. Sorry. Pica. And Cropper sends us another of his nice, helpful, smiley, regretful faxes, offering access to the stamp collection and every possible assistance with microfilm. You haven't said anything to anyone, only the librarian. I'll get over there. Patriotism will have to do instead of funding. Stop the drain. They wouldn't. I wouldn't trust anyone faced with Cropper's cheeky book, not further than I could see. Blackadder was struggling into his overcoat, a shabby British war. Rowan had given up all thought, in any case not very realistic, of discussing the purloined letters with Blackadder. He did, however, ask, "Can't you tell me anything about Wright called Lamotte?" Isidore Lamotte, mythologist, 1832. Mythologist indigène de la Bretagne et de la Grande Bretagne. Also Mythologie Française, a great scholarly compendium of folklore and legends, suffused by a kind of fashionable search for the key to all mythologies, but also with Breton national identity, culture. I should almost certainly have read them, but I have no recollection of any precise use he made of them. There was a Miss Lamotte. Oh, the daughter! She wrote religious poems, didn't she? A gloomy little booklet called Last Things. A children's stories, tale told in November. Things that go bump in the night. An epic which they say is unreadable. I think the feminists are interested in her, said Paola. They would be, said Blackadder. They haven't any time for Randolph Ashe. All they want is to read Helen's endless journal. Once our friend in there has actually managed to bring it to the light of day. They think Randolph Ashe suppressed Helen's writing and fed off her imagination. They would have a hard time proving that. I think if they were interested in proof, which I'm not sure they are, they know what there is to find before they've seen it. All they've got to go on is that she spent a lot of time lying on the sofa, and that's hardly unusual for a lady in her time and circumstances. The real problem, and Beatrice's, is that Ellen Ashe is dull. No Jane Carlyle, more's the pity. Poor old Beatrice began by wanting to show how self-denying and supportive Ellen Ashe was, and she messed around looking up every recipe for gooseberry jam and every jaunt to Broadstairs for 25 years. Can you believe it? And woke up to find that no one wanted self-denial and dedication anymore. They wanted to prove that Ellen was raging with rebellion and pain and untapped talent. Poor Beatrice! One publication to her name and a slim book called Helpmeets without irony doesn't go down well with today's feminists. One little anthology in 1950 of wise, witty, and tender sayings from the female companions of the great. The Wordsworth and Carlyle and Tennyson, Nash, Ellen Nash, but the women's studies people can get their hands on all that stuff to publish as long as poor old Bea is still the official editor. She doesn't know what's hit her. Roland did not want to hear another long speech from Blackadder about Beatrice Nest's long-delayed edition of Ellen Nash. There was a note that came into Blackadder's voice when he got onto the subject of Beatrice, a jarring, snarling note that put Roland in mind of hounds baying. He had never heard hounds baying except on the television. The idea of Cropper produced a furtive, conspiratorial look in the scholar. Roland then offered to accompany Blackadder to the London Library. He went off to look for coffee. After that he could pursue Miss Lamothe, who now had an identity of sorts. Through the catalogue, like any other dead soul, he emerged amongst the Egyptian heavyweights, and saw between two huge stone legs something rapid and white and golden that turned out to be Fergus Wolfe, also heading for coffee. Fergus was very tall, with brassy hair cut long on top and short at the back. In the 1980s version of the 1930s, over a dazzling white heavy sweater and loose black trousers like a Japanese martial artist. He smiled at Roland a pleased, voracious smile, with bright blue eyes and long mouth terribly full of strong white teeth. He was older than Roland, a child of the 60s, who had temporarily dropped out, opted for freedom and Parisian revolutions, sitting at the feet of Bath's Foucault before coming back to dazzle Prince Albert College. He was pleasant enough in general, though most people who met him formed the vaguest of ideas. He might be dangerous in some unspecified way. Roland liked Fergus because Fergus seemed to like him. Fergus was writing a deconstructive account of Balzac's chef d'oeuvre inconnu. Roland had ceased to be surprised that an English department was sponsoring the study of French books. There seemed to be nothing else nowadays, and in any case, Roland did not want to be thought insular. His own French owing to his mother's passionate interference with his education was good. Fergus sprawled in the cafeteria banquet and said the challenge was to deconstruct something that had apparently already deconstructed itself. Since the book was about a painting that turned out to be nothing but a chaotic mass of brushstrokes, Roland listened politely and said, "Do you know anything about Miss Lamothe, who wrote children's stories and religious poetry in the 1850s and thereabouts?" Fergus laughed rather a long time at this, and said tersely, "I should. Who was she?" "Christabel Lamothe, daughter of Isidore, the mythographer. Last Things, Tales Told in November, an epic called The Fairy Melusine. Very bizarre. Do you know about Melusine? She was a fairy who married a mortal to gain soul, and made a pact that he would never spy on her on Saturdays. And for years he never did, and they had 6 sons, all with strange defects, odd ears, giant tusks, and cat's head growing out of one cheek. 3 eyes, that sort of thing. One was called Geoffrey à la Grande Dame, and one was called Horrible. Horrible. She built castles, real ones that still exist, in Poitou. And in the end, of course, he looked through the keyhole, or made one in her steel door with his sword pointed according to one version. And there she was in a great marble bath disporting herself, and from the waist down she was a fish or a serpent. Rabelais says an andouille, a kind of huge sausage. The symbolism is obvious. She bit the water with her muscular tail, and he said nothing and she did nothing until Geoffroy, the tough son, took exception to his brother Fromond, taking refuge in a monastery, and when he wouldn't come out, he piled up brushwood and burned the whole thing down, monks and Fromond and all. And when this was reported, Raymondin, he was the original knight, the husband, noise and battering the stone. Sorry, I blotted a line again. I go back just a bit. Sorry. Gafes del oficio. Said, then Raymondin said, This is all your fault. I should never have married a horrible snake. And then she reproached him and turned into a dragon, and flew away round the battlements, making a terrible noise and battering the stones. Oh, before that she gave him strict injunctions to be sure to kill Horrible, and he would destroy them, which was duly done. And she comes back to the Count of Lusignan to foretell deaths. She is a kind of Dame Blanche, or Fata Bianca, la madrina. There are all sorts of mythological and psychoanalytic interpretations you can imagine. Christabel Lamotte wrote this long and very convoluted poem about Melusina's story in 1860s, and it was published at the beginning of the 1870s. It is an odd affair, tragedy, and romance and symbolism rampant all over it. A kind of dream world full of strange beasts and hidden meanings, and a really weird sexuality and sensuality. The feminists are crazy about it. They say it expresses women's important desire. It wasn't much read until they rediscovered it. Virginia Woolf knew it. She adduced it as an image of the essential androgyny of the creative mind. But the new feminists see Melusina in her bath as a symbol of self-sufficient female sexuality needing no poor males. I like it. It's disturbing. It keeps changing focus from very precise description of the scaly tail to cosmic battles. That's very useful. I looked it up. Why do you want to know? I came across a reference in Randolph Ash. There's a reference to almost everything in Randolph Ash, sooner or later. Why did I make you laugh? I became an involuntary expert on Christabel Lamotte. There are 2 people in the world who know all that is not known about Christabel Lamotte. One is Professor Leonora Stern in Tallahassee, and the other is Dr. Maud Bailey in Lincoln University. I met them both at that Paris conference on sexuality and textuality. I went too. If you remember, I don't think they like men. Nevertheless, I had a brief affair with a redoubtable Moor in Paris and then here." He stopped and frowned to himself. He opened his mouth to say more and then closed it again. He said after a time, "She Moore runs a women's resource center in Lincoln." Algo más que escupir. "They've got quite a lot of Christabels and published papers there. If you want anything out of the way, there's where to look." "I might, thanks." "What is she like? Will she let me?" "She thinks men's blood with cold," said Fergus, with a lot of undecodable feeling. 7 minutos como la página 7, la última.